Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with Tim Padgett to talk more about my conversation with Abigail Favale about her remarkable book, The Genesis of Gender. Tim, I don't know about you, but I was a little surprised to learn that gender as a major concept actually had a recent genesis, that gender is a word that used to languish in the field of grammar mostly until it was promoted by feminist writers in the 20th century to become a much more malleable, broad-reaching alternative to sex. I didn't really know that because we're accustomed to using it in relation to sex.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's just another example of, I forgot what I was reading recently that was talking about the way that so many of the things that we take for granted as everybody thinks are so very new. So many of the concepts that the culture and even we ourselves that we just assume are long-standing traditions of conversations and philosophies and whatnot are actually pretty new. I thought it was really good to have her bring this in as someone coming from a literary background, someone who studies language. She brings that with an authority. I mean, you and I can talk about that and be correct, but she's read all the books. She's read all the footnotes. She's read all that kind of thing. And that really gives her a sense of authority in the way that she's able to speak about that.
Well, yeah, she was a true believer. She's not just someone who's taken the spelunking tour through feminist thought. She actually was pretty well bought in for a long time.
Well, it almost gives her the virtue of someone like, a C.S. Lewis or Augustine of Hippo, in the sense of she was on the other side of things and came to a different, very carefully. Though I would say that one thing is, you and I have talked about this before, either offline or I don't know if we've talked about it here. There's the notorious zeal of the convert. And there's so many people who can be so anti what they were in a derisive sort of way. But I appreciate that in your conversation with her, that she shows respect for at least the goals in so many ways for the world that she used to be so much a part of. And that's really good, because it can be easy to become snide once you leave a certain way of looking at the world. And I didn't really catch that she was snide about it at all. She disagreed, but she wasn't snide. So I really appreciate that.
Well, if anything, I thought she remained fairly sympathetic to some of the aims that feminists have. This is really interesting because it ties in with something we were just talking about before we started recording in Christopher Watkins' book, Biblical Critical Theory. And one of the things that Watkin brings out is a point that's been made again and again in a lot of different books and accounts of the rise of secular progressive moral thought, is that the impulses a lot of times are very suspiciously reminiscent of old Christian impulses. Everyone who knows me knows I mention Tom Holland a lot, but it is what he does at the last couple of chapters of Dominion, where he surveys the modern feminist and woke movements. And he says a lot of Christians could get the impression that there's nothing less like Christianity than these movements, because it's deconstructing historically accepted categories of thought that go back, to the Apostle Paul and the Jewish imagination before him. I mean, nobody questioned the existence of male and female in natural terms. Paul just said, well, you're equal as regards your salvation in Christ. But he says this impulse that wants to lift women up into equality and is in the process deconstructing the very concept of sex and replacing it with these malleable ideas of gender, is actually a Christian impulse that's been divorced from Christian metaphysics. And it's just working its way through like an acid, the things that we believe. And Watkin even quotes Chesterton in that famous passage where he says that the modern ideologies are really Christian virtues that have, the modern world is full of old Christian virtues that have gone asunder from one another and are now running about, wandering around on their own, just sort of wreaking havoc because each of them has been set up as the supreme virtue, equality being the one we're talking about here. And that's very helpful in Favale's account, that she acknowledges up front, look, there are some good aims, there's some gold within the dross of feminism that compels people and draws them to it, and compelled her and drew her to it. The problem, she says, is that the feminists have always misdiagnosed it, increasingly as the different waves progressed, have misdiagnosed the problem and so have prescribed the wrong solution for it. Christians, as an alternative, have a far better, more realistic solution that accords with reality.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely vital. And I put some notes about that. I had a professor once, an African-American professor, and he said he never could have come to Christ had it not been for Malcolm X. Now, that sounds particularly for those of us of conservative bent. That's like, how does that even work? I mean, I think perhaps people who look like you and I, it's particularly hard for us to grasp with that.
And Malcolm X would represent the more radical wing of the civil rights movement, the direct action wing. That's instead of persuading people like King,
so much more hardcore than the MLK. But what he meant by that was before he could see himself as a sinner, as someone who could have done wrong, he had to see himself as someone with dignity. And what the world was telling him was that he had no dignity. He had no value. He had no purpose. He was just a black man, a lesser being. But Malcolm X comes along and tells him, you have value. You have dignity. You matter. Once he made that leap to understand that he was a human being, he was a man, someone with dignity, not just an animal, not a lesser being, then he could come face to face with the idea that as a man, he was not living up to the standards that as a man he should follow, as a human he should follow. And so that it was a very interesting thing. And I hadn't quite thought of those terms. I think it was a very healthy thing. I think that's something important for Christians to remember, Christians and like-minded conservatives to remember as we have conversations with people, is that I think it was a C.S. Lewis line. He said that no religion is 100% false or something to that effect. That is that, when you look at something like Islam, when you look at Islam, they do have this robust monotheism, and that matters, right? The otherness of God, and that's a good thing that they emphasize there. They're wrong about all sorts of other things.
They've even contributed a really darn good cosmological argument to the
Yes, exactly,
debate.
Yeah. But when you look at things, I mean, a famous example that gets tossed around in our circles is that, communism is a Christian heresy. And actually, I think we have a breakpoint. If it hasn't come out yet, it's going to be shortly, that Maria Baer wrote, talking about that humanism is a Christian heresy, which is very a Tom Holland kind of thing to talk about. Even things that we think of as disgusting, like the incel movement, which is these men who have such a warped view of themselves, of women, all sorts of warpedness. But they're responding to something real in the world in that in certain ways, not an exhaustive way, but in certain ways, their maleness has been degraded. As we saw in that video that I think we passed around on our team about, it was hard for, what are men good for, and how it was hard for people to come up with an answer to what men were good for. And so these incels, despite their warpedness in their practices for sure, and definitely their ideologies, they're resonating with something that's wrong in the world. And so I think when we see in a less repellent form, when we see these things like the feminist movement, they're recognizing that, a lot of men treat women like cattle. A lot of men treat women like lesser beings, not as fully dignified human beings. And particularly in kind of this, if you take this, quasi-pagan view of the world where power is all that matters, advancement is all that matters, well, not only do women have less physical strength, but they tend to have less social strength. And so they're treated as lesser beings. Since they have less power, they have less virtue. They have less value. That's what is the perception that comes. And so I think that that's something that Christians need to remember when we talk to these people. For one thing is to say, yeah, you're right. You're right to object to this. Also, it shows that this is, and not only simply to say that it's right, to say this, let me show you the full story. You see something wrong in the world, but your answer isn't enough. Your answer isn't enough. For the communists, your answer of coming up with this world system where all the vanguard of the proletariats and the party is going to control everything. They're reacting to a real injustice in the world, but they're creating its own monster. In feminism, they're reacting to something that's real and problematic in the world, but their solution isn't right. And we can say to them, there's more. You're right to object to this, or if it's a good thing, you're right to praise this, but there's more.
Yeah, one of the things that Favale hits on that I thought was very helpful is that in defining equality, which you have to do in order to promote the equality of women, in order to promote their dignity, right? Feminism made this catastrophically wrong turn, which was to define women's dignity in, ironically, masculine terms. So in order to be dignified, in order to be have any autonomy, in order to have equality and agency in society, a woman must essentially do the things that a man does, right? So according to the feminist, that means that she's got to, well, it's the stereotypical put on a tie and go to work kind of thing. We saw that in the 20th century, helped out through wartime efforts and so forth, and the Rosie the Riveter ideal that was sort of the propaganda that the government put out. And and then the necessity of the whole thing, right? Like somebody's got to work the munitions factories, and that was an incidental to the process that assisted this ideological transition where the good life for women was painted over successive generations and waves of feminism in increasingly masculine terms. And Favale does not shy away from the fact that this wasn't merely an idealization of the masculine. It was actually a denigration of the distinctly and bodily feminine. So several of the feminist writers, and she highlights a lot of quotations from them that really illustrate this point, but several of the feminist writers just didn't like being women very much. They kind of hated being women. They hated their female bodies. They hated, as she calls it, the physical animality of those bodies and how much those bodies tied them to processes that were not idealizable in masculine terms. That there's the gestating and the childbirth and the breastfeeding, and the female anatomy is configured significantly around these things. And feminists hated that. They hated the burden that imposed. And so a lot of them drew the understandable but also horrifying conclusion: what we need to do is make women less physically female. We need to make them behave less physically like females and more physically like men, because that's the path to freedom. And as soon as you turn that little corner and begin to have that thought, things like breaking the female reproductive system on a semi-permanent basis, the regular expectation that women will be essentially infertile, that's the default state of a woman's body, is to be infertile, to be sterile, to be on birth control permanently, or to have a device working against her reproductive cycle. That all of these are things that make sense if you first assume that female agency requires that a woman not be tied to her body in the way that she naturally is. That's a massive shift ideologically, and one that you look at. You look at the physical configuration of human beings and you wonder, how did that happen? How do we really come to declare war on our bodies, or to accept this odd feminist hatred of the female body, of female embodiment? And yet we have in many key ways. And that's a point that I really applaud her for making, because, there's a sense in which I guess a woman who wants to have the trajectory that she has had over the course of her life, her academic training, her work as in leadership now in academia at Notre Dame, which is her new position, her publishing career, all of these things take a lot of time, right? They require a lot of sacrifice. And as much as pop culture may tell women, well, you can have it all, sacrifices do have to be made. You can't actually have it all. You do have to sort of work through your priorities in life. And when you consider the fact that, I know as a lot of Christian women struggle with, when you consider the fact that, well, your fertility is concentrated in a very early part of your life, right? Your potential for writing output and study and so forth is not confined to that early part of your life, right? There's no biological clock for learning like there is for having a family and bearing children. And so that's a tension you got to work through. So I really applaud her for actually making that difficulty clear, but pointing out the major misstep that feminism makes when it declares war on the body itself.
I saw a clip from Jordan Peterson recently, and he was talking about the emphasis on status and so many things like this and having it all. And he was talking about what does it actually take to have it all, to be the top of various fields. And he said that usually it is, there's a reason that usually it's men who do this, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. It was interesting. He meant that in order to become the top of these business fields, as a lawyer, even as an artist, even all these sorts of things, you kind of have to be a jerk. Because you have to deny so many things of your relationships. You have to treat your family, treat your love life, treat your just being a decent human being as vastly secondary at best. You have to work these hours that are insane. I mean, you and I probably work in terms of we do lots of reading and writing and stuff like that. We work a lot of hours, but some of these guys who are, they're starting out as a lawyer, the number of hours that, junior partners and whatnot put in, that doctors put in order to be at the top of your field. And there's 164 hours or whatever it is in a week. And you have to, they're spending 70, 80, 90 hours a week full on working these things. You have to set aside so much. And frankly, most people are not willing to do that, because most people, they want to have a life. They want to have friends. They want to have family. And it does just so happen that those who are most likely to be willing to completely sacrifice those things tend to be male. And as he said in Jordan Peterson clip, he said that, and those people are not easy to be around. And again, he didn't mean, well, they're difficult, but you got to deal with them. He meant these guys are jerks. And that's something I think that's missing in some of these conversations is, you want to be the top of the field? Well, frankly, that probably means you're not a very nice person. Probably means you're not a good, this isn't necessarily an admirable thing. Related thing, when you were talking about it's kind of denying the femininity, there's, in our line of work, we get called lots of names from time to time. One of the names is someone meant it as a compliment. I got called a feminist, which is very unusual for someone like me. I had written something and someone didn't know that I had written it. And I was talking about the fact that for certain waves of, the feminist movement, as you were saying, that kind of the embrace of the masculine, traditionally masculine traits of competition, of status, of putting things forward, the whole thing of power. And now I know you're a little younger than I am, but the girl band, you had the boy bands, but you also had the Spice Girls back in the 90s. And their little thing was they'd go out on stage, half dressed, saying girl power. And I remember thinking, how is this an expression of female power, of female whateverness? Because, what straight male is offended or threatened by 20-something young women dancing around on stage half dressed? This is not girl power.
Seems like something that the worst straight males would kind of order up.
Exactly. It was a surrender of what every male at his worst wants. Regular access to anonymous sexual contact, where that is the full presentation. And I remember I was talking to a friend around in the same basic time period, and she was arguing that strippers were powerful because she was the one on the stage. I'm like, the thing is, it's not. This embrace, this is one, it's just a surrender to exactly what a male wants. That woman is only powerful. The stripper is only powerful in the sense of that moment. She has the man's attention, but it's completely a man-centered thing. So many of these things that we see are not only just denials of femininity, of the beauties, of wonders of femaleness, but it's a complete surrender to what men at their worst have always wanted.
Yeah. And the sexed nature of things is female and also male, and those things combine to make the family, which is in the crosshairs of some of the key feminist writers. So, Carl Trueman takes Wilhelm Reich to task in Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, but Trueman does it too. But Favale takes figures like Simone de Beauvoir to task for essentially declaring war on the family and saying the family is the thing that's got to go, because the family is where these gendered roles are inculcated. And this is where gender begins to take on this massive importance, which is so interesting because it has an assumption at its base that if the family is where little boys are taught that they have to grow up to be men, and little girls are taught they have to grow up to be women, like Mr. Rogers said, only the boys can be the daddies, only the girls can be the mommies. We covered that recently on Breakpoint. If that's the case, then the family needs to be abolished. We need to have a radical social revolution. But what is the assumption behind that? I find that assumption so interesting, Tim, that all of these concepts depend on sort of Rousseau's idea of a blank slate state of nature-ism, that boys and girls are born with different reproductive systems, but those have nothing to do with their overall configuration as persons. That really that's just plumbing. It's incidental, right? Biological sex, which none of these feminists, for the record, have actually denied. They don't deny that these organs exist. They deny that they're relevant to these things we call men and women, that a woman is a thing you become through enculturation and performativity, that a man is a thing you become through enculturation and performativity. And that I think it was Judith Butler who hit on that one, and Favale talks about her. And a lot of students, as she recalls, would encounter those claims and say, yeah, it's a performance. We're just performing when we try to act masculine or when we try to act feminine or whatever. We need to down with the patriarchal social constructs. We have to get down to our real, natural, pre-social states. And that's when we can be truly who we are. So we get that expressive individualism. Well, why in the world should we assume that we're really just born as blank slates? That our true selves are these sexless, generic human units that onto which things are imposed? When, as an author like Anthony Eslin points out, the entire testimony of all of human history is against us in saying that these are that maleness and femaleness, manhood and womanhood are social constructs. Now, given that there are lots of cultural expressions of those things that are going to differ from place to place, but I think we really exaggerate those differences. It's a very self-serving exaggeration. And it comes back to this uniquely Western tick, this impulse that we have to sort of dissolve all differences and always move to a higher level of abstraction. There's this sort of universal acid that the Western conscience has used for a long time on concepts of that previous generations took for granted, where we say, well, the only reason we behave that way is simply because of this difference. We can't stop people from doing XYZ simply because of, and it started with very rational things to sort of deconstruct, like skin color, right? Skin color is a very arbitrary thing on which to base social categories. Like say, you can eat at this lunch counter, you can't eat at this one. You can use this water fountain, you can't use this one. You can go to this class, you can't go to that class because of the shade of your skin, the amount of your melanin. Well, it is silly to separate people just because of their skin color. But is it silly to separate people just because of their sex? In their bathrooms that they use, the locker rooms they use, the sports they're involved in. Is it silly to say you can't get married just because you happen to be the same sex? Well, that's where that impulse, that essentially good impulse to do away with arbitrary distinctions that are used unfairly to discriminate against people becomes cancerous. And we start to say, well, we want to move up to a higher level of abstraction and say, well, marriage is not really sexed. It doesn't necessarily depend on male and female. It can actually just be two people who love each other. Or sports don't actually depend on which type of the two body plans you have and what advantages those give you or not. That's just an arbitrary distinction we're making. So we're going to dissolve that and move up to a higher level of abstraction and say it only matters if you're a good athlete. And we do this again and again to the point where male and female actually begin to corrode and fall apart because this acid of always climbing up to a higher level of abstraction has eaten through them and made them useless. So we're now attacking reality itself with this instinct or tick that says we always have to say just because or simply because you are this, you can't do that. There are societies in history where you can look at them from an anthropologist or sociologist perspective and say, wow, those people drew some crazy distinctions between different groups, like, say, historic India. You have these castes, and I mean, you're born in one of those castes, you are stuck, my friend, especially if you're at the bottom of the pile. And we would look at those people and say, what's the essential difference between these people? I don't see that there is an essential difference. You're just keeping one group down just for the heck of it, right? I would say, I'm Western, but I would say that's unjust at the bottom of it because it's essentially arbitrary. But is it unjust to say that only women can be mothers? Is that rooted at bottom in an arbitrary distinction or in a natural distinction, one that we could really see in people's physical embodiment? A lot of the modern West is saying it's an arbitrary distinction. And that's what feminism is kind of trying to say. And so I can see the big picture of how this adoption of this category of gender by feminists came to eventually dissolve the category of sex, which is, how we titled the podcast.
There is a sense in which our society rightly recognized some great abuses that had been happening within our society and within a great many other societies. We recognized certain unhealthy practices regarding the difference between men and women, and some very real unhealthy and immoral practices as well, dealing with different races. And you look back in history, that's one of the interesting things when you talk about these great abuses in history, when you talk about racial things, they developed. They didn't just they weren't always there. They developed over time, and as different ethnic groups were contrasting with one another, they began to see themselves in terms of their race. When you look at ancient world, like the Roman stuff, they don't often talk about race and things like that. It was something that developed due to certain historical circumstances. But that means that those were indeed arbitrary. And as time went on, the pressures built and began to see, okay, yeah, these are arbitrary. They're not just merely arbitrary distinctions. These are wrong. There's a horribleness to it.
Especially when you're not even talking about something like culture, ethnicity, or nationality. You're literally talking about the color of someone's skin. So it doesn't matter that this man, this woman is a fellow American who actually grew up in your society, speaks your language, shares your culture, and it lives under your laws, right? It's just the fact that they have a different skin color that you're basing your sort of discriminatory regime, or that people did base a discriminatory regime on. That's not an intrinsic difference. That's not a thing that's actually rational to draw those kinds of distinctions based on.
It was horrible, and you can see the shallowness of it. For all the tension of the 20th century when it came to race, it came unglued, not simply, not easily, not painlessly, for sure. But there were certain things that caused the house of cards to fall. You look at some of the most effective ways that you ended racial discrimination were in sports and in the military. And I think that one of the key things about those are both uniformed services, right? You put on a uniform, and that's what makes you you. In 1947, you have the integration of the military, and that happened with all sorts of bumps and pains and horrors. But on the other hand, it did not take that long before what mattered was the guy was the guy in the trench with me wearing the same uniform as me, and that's what mattered. And then in sports as well, you see these famous things about like Bear Bryant. I'm an Alabama fan, and Bear Bryant, whatever his moral stance, he really pushed for some of these integration things. He may have simply wanted to win football games, but he pushed for integration on these things. And it shows the shallowness of it, that they put the uniform on the black guys and the white guys, and all of a sudden everybody's fine with it. And that was actually very interesting. But what you see, I think, when we're talking about things like the issue of maleness and femaleness and relating it to those issues is there's a Latin phrase I won't try to pronounce because I'm not very good at it, but it's abuse does not negate legitimate use. What I mean by that is that the world looked at the horrors of racial discrimination and certain horrors when it came to certain sins and immoralities when it came to gender, sexual discrimination. And they said, okay, discrimination is bad. Therefore, all discrimination is bad. Therefore, there's no difference between anyone whatsoever. And so I remember when I took a college class, and one of our assignments, I think it was I don't know what it was, sociology class or something. We were supposed to go to a toy store. And you're supposed to go see, in the past, there was the pink row and the blue row, you might say. You go and you still see this in a lot of places. I think in California, it's actually illegal now.
Everything's illegal in California.
Yeah, this is true.
Except pot.
This is true. Very much. And all sorts of things. But yeah, you go in the toy aisles were very much gendered. And in one sense, that was wrong. In the sense that there are girls who like Star Wars. And there are boys who don't like Star Wars, or whatever it is that they do like. They noted something real. People noted that, it's not so simple as only boys only like Star Wars and trucks and tanks, and only girls only like pink and dolls and dollhouses and whatnot. That was an exaggeration. But the thing is, there's an exaggeration of a real thing. You get, generally speaking, you give boys a choice, they're going to go for the trucks and tanks and whatnot. Generally speaking. And it's one of those things that, it's the difference between a description and a prescription. Generally, a little boy is not going to go pick up a doll. Generally. Sometimes he will, but generally he's not going to. And the reverse is true as well.
Well, and this is where you get that blank slateism coming in, because the unspoken contention in mixing the toy aisles is that the only reason that boys gravitate toward the Star Wars and the guns and the trucks and things like that is because they've been taught by their upbringing, and they've internalized these values that this is what a little boy who's begun to become a man likes. And so I'm going to go for that. Whereas the girls see the pink and pink is a sort of arbitrary signifier of these things because in some cultures, pink is like masculine. It's very funny, but, or royal or rich or something, but they look for the baby dolls, the strollers, things that with toys they can dress up and make beautiful. And there's a bunch of crafts and stuff that go in there. And there's all kinds of things in the girls aisle that used to exist in most stores. And they gravitate toward those things. And the contention is, again, that the girls have just been taught. They've just been acculturated into that's what they've absorbed those values. And that if you actually had a blank slate child, there'd be no preference one for the other, because this is not a matter of nature. It's a matter of nurture. And that's the fundamental feminist contention, that people really are blank generic human units, and then this is a performance that we take on later because of our culture, and then that's illegitimate to impose things on it. The counterclaim, which I think is, hilariously easy to make, is that look, you can do a cultural control for this. Look at every society in the history of the world. There's no society where men are the primary caregivers of children. There's no society where women are the primary warriors and builders and, hunters. It literally does not exist. It is a non-starter anthropologically. And so you're left with this question, as Esalen says in his book, okay, is it more likely that these things really do reflect some intrinsic difference between the sexes that goes down to the deepest level of our being? Or that every culture just happens to be in this grand conspiracy to force these essentially equivalent and generic children to be one or the other thing? Which is it? I mean, take your pick. And to me, it's pretty obvious that we're dealing with something that's intrinsic here. And if it is intrinsic, and if people do have natures, if we are differentiated in male and female ways as human beings, then our culture and our institutions and our habits and our language should reflect that. This is another reason why I think Favale's treatment is so incredibly helpful and incisive, because she doesn't just describe and condemn a cultural progression. She does a very condensed version of what Carl Trueman does in many ways in Rise and Triumph. And she picks one stream of that story and focuses in on it, the feminist stream. And she rightly points out that what's happening here is a revolution in philosophy and language, where we are now we're imbibing nominalism to the point where we really do believe that our language does not reflect realities that are intrinsic or that are external to us, right? They're intrinsic to the world that we look at, male and female, for instance, that our language is just imposing those things on the world. It's a power play, and it could be otherwise, right? So why shouldn't it be otherwise? But what if that's not true? What if the essentialist narrative is true? She points to Aristotle as, like, I guess the chief proponent or exponent of this in Western history. But the idea that really things really do have nature's essences, that they can be discerned and they can be grouped according to those essences. That's the old realist view of things. And that's the Christian metaphysic, but it's been lost now. And bringing that out is really helpful beyond, it's not just a philosophical academic discussion. It's helpful because if you really go around, look at the world and you say, I'm just grouping things according to convention and names, there really is no such thing as a woman. And most people don't realize that is a fundamental contention of majority of feminist thought today. There is no such thing as a woman in reality. It's just social convention and a convention of language. And it's helpful to use that convention because it helps us unite a bunch of oppressed people and lift them up. But there's no such thing as a woman. And Favale is on the other side of this question now with Christians saying, no, there is such a thing as a woman. We can define that, and we should.
Yeah, and I think that I think I mentioned this in a conversation we had yesterday. In your discussion with her, that you each noted that feminists will speak for women, but they are a little fuzzy when it comes down to what a woman is, right? And I think that the reason they don't, whether consciously or unconsciously, is that if they do say what a woman is, then you begin to get into that question of essences. Is there something that is true and good? And I think that's the great strength of Favale's thing, is because she's pointing out this very practical view of things, that yes, there's such a thing as a woman, and you can have a conversation, and there's variations about how you want to discuss it, but there is something that's real. That's the first thing, but also that it's good. And that's what so often is missing, is that for certain waves of feminism, and for this kind of quasi-Gnostic world we live in now, where there is no reality, it's just what you make of it, it's all social convention, that you can't say that you can't say that something's real, but you also can't say that it's good. So much of what we end up with, some of these feminisms, plural, is, as you said, a denigration of femininity, of femaleness, not just femininity in like this acculturated way of, dresses and pink and whatnot, but in terms of like biological femaleness, that it's a lesser state. And I love the way that she's able to bring this out. She speaks very positively, not only of feminism's goal, but of the goodness of the femaleness.
Wouldn't a real feminism be the type of thing that looks at those concrete realities of female embodiment and says, okay, we need to build a just society around these things instead of trying to medicate them out of their function, to break them, to shut them down, to make them irrelevant, to get around them. That's quite aside from the theological and ethical considerations of, birth control, yes or no, is this okay, is this ethical? And that's a different discussion. I think we could have some other time. But the really interesting thing to me about the fact that she brings that up and demonstrates how central contraceptives and abortion are to the feminist project is that they essentially look at the female body and say, this is a problem. We got to fix this. This cannot work according to its nature because that keeps women down. It keeps them from fulfilling an alternative nature that we believe they have, which is as a blank, generic human unit. A real feminism that really honors women, that really wants to exalt what they are, lift them up, and then build a just society around those realities, would look at the female embodiment and say, okay, how can we build things around that? How can we affirm and celebrate the natural function of a woman's body and then build a society around that? That seems to me like an obvious point, and that's precisely what we're not doing, because as soon as you start to say the female body and its reproductive capacity, its capacity to nurture and bring new human beings into existence, that is a priority, that we should actually prioritize those things. You get labeled a regressive, misogynistic, you just want women to be barefoot and pregnant and so forth. And you don't want them to have sexual liberty like men supposedly have, right? To be promiscuous. Anyway, this has been a good discussion, Tim. I highly recommend the book, guys. I think that there's some things that points of caution or further discussion that need to be had, but this is just a very, very important book. There's a lot in here that will move the conversation forward in important ways. And so I'm glad we could have Dr. Favale on the podcast, and I'm glad we could talk further about her work here. So thank you, Tim.
Absolutely. Good conversation.